Okay, hello guys. Thank you so much for joining to this live session. My name is Hamid Hassanzadeh. I'm founder of Parametric Architecture page, and I'm your host now. We have a very great and famous guest today. He's a Mexican architect and designer and founder of Free Enterprise. His name is Fernando Romero. I will invite him a couple of in a couple of seconds to this live session. I would like to go for a new introduction about him. Let me just read about Free. Free is a global architecture and industrial design firm founded by Fernando Romero with offices in New York and Mexico City. So I'm inviting Fernando Romero to join to this live session and talk about his architecture and his visions and his projects. Okay, let me see. Guys, I'm just making you wait for a couple of minutes, and there we go. Hello, Fernando.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to this live session.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. We made it finally.
We made it.
Yeah, thank you. I made an introduction about you, and if you want to say hello to our followers, the mic is yours, and you can just say
everybody.
Hello.
Yeah, perfect. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be having this conversation with all of you this morning. Hope everybody stay at home, staying safe. So I look forward for this conversation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to my questions. First of all, would you please introduce yourself and your office Free to our followers?
Yes, I'm an architect based in Mexico and New York. My name is Fernando Romero. I'm the founder of Free, and I have been doing architecture the last 20 years.
That's great. Okay. When did you start at this office?
Well, I was trained in Europe, and when I came back, I started my own practice in Mexico. As most of the architects, you start by developing your big first projects. I start to do small projects, and I start to do an investigation of the transformation of Mexico City, and that's how basically I started the office. And then over the time, we start to build more projects and more credibility, and start to get involved in projects beyond Mexico. But yeah, I was always convinced I wanted to have my own practice in Mexico because this is where I have been raised, and because I think Mexico is an extraordinary country that has an amazing culture of more than 20 centuries, one of the most biodiverse places in the planet. So I have been always very connected with my country, and I felt that was incredible to try to achieve what I want always to do, that was to have my own practice and my own laboratory in Mexico.
Okay. I'm interested about the journey of you becoming an architect. Would you please tell our followers, how did you become an architect?
Yes, it was partly accident, but partly things that you don't plan that end up to happen as an accident. In one hand, I was grandson of a visionary developer that I started to do houses for the people in the base of the pyramid, the people with bigger needs in the country. And he has a beautiful modern house that when I was a little kid, I was spending a lot of time in that house. So probably that was the beginning of my awareness of how modern architecture can make a difference in terms of how you live. And as well, my parents gave me something that I was accidentally given as an opportunity in my early childhood. That was, they love to travel, and they show us a lot of the world. So I was able to see the Great Wall in China when I was 10, or to see the Eiffel Tower when I was 12. And I think maybe those experiences make a huge impression of me. But I was not very conscious about that you were able to design buildings. So much that I didn't apply to architecture. I applied to communication because as a teenager, I was very interested in writing. I spent a lot of time reading, and I thought maybe it would be amazing to be a writer. So I applied to communication because that was a possible way to become a writer. I was not accepted, and accidentally they offered me architecture. So I take it as a next second option. I was the worst student in my class because most of the people that studied with me were sons of architects. So they were much more aware of the back part of how you actually build. They were much more into the contact of construction and technical drawings that I wasn't. So I remember myself second year thinking maybe this is not for me. Maybe I should quit because I was definitely not a good student. However, I was president of the Student Society, and this enabled me to have the opportunity to have contact with great architects. I invite Alvaro Siza to give a lecture to the university, for example, or Enrique Miralles, and the opportunity to be next to those great architects started to give me an impression that was something of great importance for the community, but also like an extraordinary life, no? Somebody that can. I remember showing the National University to Alvaro Siza and spending a time in the bench. And I remember him watching the buildings and just sketching the buildings and thinking that his sketches were going to be materialized forever, no? And being having the pleasure to have dinner with Calatrava when I was a student, and he sketched to me how to do a bridge. And I think those I was able to have experiences as a student that enabled me to see the full potential of how you can actually transform an idea into reality and make an impact in the world. So at that time, I was extremely interested, not yet convinced that maybe I have the talent, but extremely interested in architecture. Fascinated by modernity. When I was a student, I learned a lot about Le Corbusier, the modern architects, and of course Barragan as one extraordinary architect that was able to combine the best of the international movement with the best of local extraordinary moments of our architecture and build his own language and make something that was both local but at the same time universal. I was, of course, very interested in all his work. And that's how I basically became an actor.
That's great. Have you ever Have you ever done any collaboration with these architects like Alvaro Siza or Santiago Calatrava?
No, with Calatrava, no. With Sisa, I invite him to do a project in Mexico, so we established a conversation and we analyzed the possibility to do a project together. But then, as you know, I was still convinced that at that time the education in Mexico was in a crisis as a result of what we have heritage from postmodern architecture. Most of the professors hasn't built. I'm also a believer that architecture has a huge connection with economy. And we have already at that time kind of passed a crisis in the 80s and another crisis in the 90s in Mexico. So there was not a good moment for architecture. So I was convinced that in order to really understand or go beyond my traditional 4 years education, I needed to go to Europe and learn more. So I went to Europe, worked with Nouvelle briefly, and then I was lucky enough to work at what many people consider was at the time the best university for an Asian architect. There was OMA in the 90s, where I was with and many young people that have their own practices now in the world that became very successful people. And partly because that was like a very interesting laboratory where Ryan was able not to try to impose to ourselves his ideas or his own way of thinking, but rather was like a critic that helped us, all of us, how to think and help us to see the potential of how design can translate specific condition, specific context in a particular singular solution. So I think that was, of course, a very important moment in I consider it still my education or my learning process. And was there in the late 90s, in 99, when I was responsible for designing a house that became the Consejo in Porto, that I finally kind of understood the full potential of what was the meaning of how you can actually transform a program into a singular solution and make an architecture that is meaningful and can have an impact. No? Is that moment where I took the decision then to come back to my country and start my own practice. No?
Great, great. So you talked about RevClass. How working with RevClass affected your architecture, actually? Experience, anything?
Um, I think it was not only cool as an OMA as a laboratory at that time, but it was also being in Holland. That specific office was only possible in that context. Like Holland as a country as a whole is an extraordinary place where creativity finds its way to become uh, a platform where multidisciplinary intelligences can transform the world and the reality in which you live. In other words, architects, engineers build solutions, private sector, government build solutions that shape the world in which you live. And experimentation is like part of the normal way to develop the society in all levels. So you see that when you take your bike, how you park your bike and how you take your money in the bank and how you pay taxes and how you use your transport and how you see green energy being produced all around you. So it's some of those countries that are now leading the planet in terms of how renewable energies are generated, not the Nordic countries. So I think the experience of being in that environment was of huge impact for myself. And the experience to work next to Ren was a privilege since his extraordinary mind was an opportunity for all of us to see the full potential of how design can be enabled to become like a tool to translate a program, not in one single way, but in thousands of ways, and allow yourselves to do an experimentation to find the best translation and best solution. No?
Yes, right. Great. So in this current situation and the pandemic and with coronavirus, how does this pandemic affected your architecture and your office?
Well,
Ev-
I think everybody's now in this moment that will shape us all for the future, and everybody's reviewing how we work and how we live, and many things are going to change. We are spending much more time connected online and much more time spending in virtual conversations like these ones. And in a way, it's a very interesting moment in history where we are realizing how developed is our technologies, but at the same time how vulnerable is our health. It's a very interesting moment in history where we have a lot of populists in power, and where finally it's being proved that the scientists is basically who are ruling now how we need to protect ourselves. No, in other words, that in moments of crisis, we finally are putting at front scientists as basically the people who has the more knowledge to drive our societies towards the future. No,
Right,
and this is related not only with coronavirus, but of course with global warming. No,
right.
for the future of our civilization, right? As architects, I think we have a lot of challenges. So architecture and economy is, of course, very connected, and many countries are, of course, going to suffer a lot in terms of this contraction of the economy, but especially the countries that are on development, such as Mexico, they're going to have a bigger impact in terms of the economies, right?
Right.
And this is saying that we are, or I think it's normal in our practice, we need to reorganize our teams. We need to rethink how we organize our energies, and we are going to probably have a period where we are going to spend a lot of time in investigations, in thinking, in research, and less than in building real projects, right? However, our practice is very blessed to have a couple of extraordinary, very interesting boutique and challenging projects that keep all our teams focused and working in projects, for example, in Korea, Temple for a Monk, or in Mexico, an extraordinary location for doing a very symbolic building next to an iconic masterpiece.
Right.
But I think as a whole, I think it's a very interesting moment for artists where our projects, and I think one of the beauties of architecture is that when we produce something is not a temporary piece of art that you can leave out of your storage, but it's basically permanent structures, no? And this moment, the word permanent, it's of heavy weight. So I think it's how we are going to become, with the technology we have available, the most useful for the future of civilization. Some of the priorities are changing. I think the priorities before were very different from the priorities we will see as civilization for the next decades. Infrastructure will remain, I think, one of the best way to create development and to create employment, to create growth, and especially countries that are in process of development, like South America, Mexico, and many countries that are still developing. We need to put special attention on how we build infrastructure to create development, social development, and economical development.
Right.
But infrastructure that must be sustainable, that it must be connected with the agenda of the planet, not an infrastructure that is based on a particular populist idea of a campaign, but more real infrastructure that will have sustainable growth, but will not have a negative impact.
Exactly. Exactly. That's right. So I'd like to ask about your projects, a couple of your projects. But before going to your projects, I would like to tell our followers that they can write the questions in the question box. And at the end of the live session, I will ask a couple of questions from our followers as well. So when we look at your project, Somaya Museum in Mexico City, we see a very unique form that this project has. And this project almost like became a new landmark for the city. So would you please discuss a little bit about the form of the project? How did it came to life, and how did it influence the user experiences?
Well, to do a museum for me is like to do a container for art. And if art is really, if architecture is really a piece of art, I think the relationship between art and architecture is never stronger than when you do a museum, right? So I think already that was an amazing opportunity, and I was surprised that the client wanted to do a museum that was surprise. He didn't want to have a traditional building. He wanted to have a building that was a special building that will make an impact, that people would like to go and see. And I think regardless of that specific form, I think the achievement or the ambition of the project was to do a destination within the city and try to boost the development of all that area. So I think for that purpose, the building is very successful. It's become the most Instagram building in the country, and without any publicity or advertising, becomes like a destination within the city. Thanks that we also were able to think and bring the Humex Museum on board. Then you have in the same location the two most important art collections of private sector in the country. One dedicated to contemporary art, that is Humex, and the other one dedicated to traditional art. Because the collection of traditional art of Mr. Slim was very diverse in its content, we thought that it was interesting to do a silhouette that was recognizable, but also silhouette that enabled us to create different floor plan typologies that translate the diversity of its collection. So he has a collection composed by cars, spoons, paintings, sculptures, and the DNA of the collection is very diverse in its content. So by having that section, we were able to create completely different experiences in each of the floor plans. And we thought that that was appealing. He loved the concept. And we proposed to have at the top the biggest floor plan, where we have in my opinion, the most relevant part of the collection, that is the sculptures of Rodin.
Right.
And to have it free of columns. And the way to achieve that was to have a roof that was hanging with a ring of compression, this balance within all the 20 columns in the perimeter that carry the facade. So even that we're in an earthquake situation and the building looks like very asymmetrical and even risk in terms of its section is at the same time extremely stable due to the
Yes.
combination of having the roof hanging on top of all the columns that act in compression. So extremely efficient structure built on record price. And what was interesting for our practice was how we can connect and combine the knowledge of the best international engineers with the best local teams, and how we were able to do something that was singular and contemporary by connecting the knowledge of international technologies and engineers with the local teams. At the same time, this was like a first step to learn that process.
Exactly.
It's like I think like in architecture, it's like you build your first project and they became like your kids, right? They and they tell you things that is part of how you grow as human being, right? And
Exactly.
you learn
Right.
like you learn to love them, right?
Exactly.
In a good way. And the reason why this project is so important for us was because then we were able to compete for the airport, and the airport was the most important architectural project for a generation, and the
Yeah.
most important infrastructural project that was ever in
I'll
the
ask about the
competition.
airport. I'll ask
Yes,
about the airport, actually.
yes,
How did
yes.
you come up with such a facade in Somalia, like with those patterns and the form of the facade?
Well, yeah, in the conversation with our client, we wanted to have a metal facade, and metal facade is highly related with one of the most iconic buildings in the beginning of the century, done by a Canadian American architect. And we didn't wanted to have something that resembles the Guggenheim of Bilbao. So we decided that the metal needs to be independent piece of metal. And that's how we arrived to the idea of the hexagon that represents the force of a group that was making a lot of sense, metaphorically speaking, with this client. But also in nature, the hexagon is something that is very adaptable to different geometries and to organic surfaces. So it was the perfect form to translate that membrane and that facade. No? So we work with Gary Technologies, developing with their latest softwares 16,000 hexagons of more than 1,000 different families. In other words, hexagons
Wow.
that were varying in their sizes. And we were able to process in 3 months record time all the construction documents. And that's how, when you arrive to the building, you don't understand really well the scale of the project, because you don't
Exactly.
have traditional windows, you don't have traditional scales or floor
Right.
plans. And that's how the building became like a singular building within the city, because you haven't seen nothing like that when you drive through. And of course, it's at the same time the meaning of the project. This is not an office building. This is a container of art.
Right.
Container of art that must have the highest security, the less energy consumption, the best conditions for the art, the most protected because it's historical art. Some of the art has been 10 centuries being produced, so you need to have very singular conditions, and that's the reason why the building looks so different from the rest of the buildings you see in the city, right?
Right. That's right. So in 2014, you designed Mexico's largest airport with Norman Foster, and the project started in the construction in 2015, and in 2018, with the general referendum of the national referendum, it just declined to continue the process of construction by public vote. So would you please talk about the process of this project and why it was just stopped the construction, and what happened exactly with this project?
Yes. Well, first of all, this was a competition, and they invite 8 Mexican architects, but none of the architects have the credentials, the proven credentials that they have built 2 or 3 airports, and the proven credentials that they have experience to design an airport of this scale. So each of the 8 Mexican architects that were Legorreta, Teodoro, Serrano, some of the best architects in the country. Some of them has already passed away, like Legorreta and Teodoro, but each of us went to talk with international partners in order to develop our schemes and then present our schemes. It was a very transparent competition where they brought international jury, more than 100 people involved in the jury. So it was a very complex process where they select the best solution based on the experts of opinions of all around the world. And I was able to be introduced to Norman Foster. He said he wanted to visit my office in New York. We have a conversation of half an hour. And we find that our agenda and our vision was very aligned, and we decided to team up together. So we designed the building that we proposed for competition along 6 months. That were a very exciting process in which we put together our teams, and we developed together the idea. An unpredictable idea because the brief suggests 2 buildings, and we develop only 1 building. And for me, it was very important that the building connects with the history of our architecture. Now, when you visit the pyramids, that I was just in Chichen Itza 2 weeks ago, or when you see the Pyramid of the Soul designed by the Aztecs, that was the most prominent structure in the continent in that time. Even when you see Anthropology Museum now in modernity in Mexico in the 70s, we have this kind of DNA of our architecture that is monumental scale. And I wanted to develop that for the proposed airport, and Norman loved the idea. And then we developed this space frame that enabled us to have up to 180 meters free of span, no columns in the central space of the project. That is the core of the project. And we were able to build a very consistent, coherent, but also functional solution. So we were chosen as the best team. We developed in record time all construction documents. And there hasn't been in the history of the country a project of that complexity that were developed at that level of detail. We designed based on the requirements of BIM 300, all the drawings. And we produced more than 10,000 drawings, documents that enables the client to build the project and to bid the project transparently. And a team of 8 construction companies were awarded to build the project. We started the construction of the project. And then you asked me why it was stopped and how it was stopped. So the government, it was not yet on power. So it was out of being legally on power. And they have done this process of the survey of the opinion of the people. But that was done not with the support of the INE. The INE is the institution in Mexico that is in charge of doing the public votes. And that was, without any doubt, the worst decision taken by any government recently. Has huge impact on the economy because this was a project that has all the international support based on all the experts and scientists and people involved in planning the best airports in the world. So institutions like Mitre that are in charge of developing all the airports in the world has approved the master plan, and the project was fully financed by the operation of the current airport. So what I can tell you is the project it was the best solution for solving the growth of the aviation in the country. And the project was fully financed, and the project was the best way to boost the development of the country, of the tourism and employment in the country. So I'm not a politician, but what I can tell you is that the project was fully financed, fully approved by all the experts, and we were not in charge of the master plan. We simply delivered the solution for the new terminal and the design of the main terminal building. I think sooner or later the project will be relaunched because it's the only viable solution of how to solve the connectivity of the country and how to do the gate to Mexico. And Mexico needs to have a gate that is at the same level of our pyramids. And you know, Mexico is one of the 5 most biodiverse countries in the planet, one of the richest in culture. And when you see countries like China, China is the country that was able to reduce poverty at the highest rate in the planet over the last 30 years, and they were able to reduce poverty by building infrastructural projects. Infrastructural
Right.
projects boost the economy, boost the investments, boost the communication, boost the tourism, and those are the projects that develop the countries. And so I firmly
Exactly.
believe that project will come sooner or later, because airports are not projects that you can improvise by saying, I would propose that the airport should be in another place. The airports are based on the knowledge of experts, right?
Exactly. That's right. So I'll ask about the Holon Temple project, which you proposed for Burning Man. And we see a unique geometry inspired by ancient Greek Holon. Could you describe this project and how this idea came to life?
Well, Burning Man is a very singular context, because it's a city that appear and disappear in a couple of days. So it's about how you do something that can be built and can disappear in days. So I think that's a huge challenge. But also, the temple is that place where people go and remember uh, difficult moments of their lives, or people that has passed away. So it's connected to a spiritual dimension of human beings that go to experience Burning Man. So what we proposed was to have almost like a kind of pantheon of 21st century, a building that connects with the universe, because that was part of the statement in the competition. We are very sorry, but of course it's part of the coronavirus moment that we're living, that this year Burning Man is postponed. But
Exactly.
we have been requested by a client to try to build the Holland Temple in Tulum, and I think it's quite interesting, because it's a very simple structure that has in itself a section that is about how you gather with people, and about something that is very atemporal, that is, since thousands of years, humans get together to share their ideas and to share their pain and to share their human dimension. And that temple is about that. It's about trying to do a building that is not about specific religion, but it's about putting the human in the center. No?
Exactly. I have a question from one of our followers, and it's Fenty Frankie. Did you receive any negative criticism from the community where your projects were, where your projects were built, and how did you react to that?
Well, I think one of the criticisms is, I think it's part of being an architect interested in doing singular buildings, is when your buildings have a nickname.
Right.
And I have designed a tower that was never built, that was heavily addressed in newspapers and media with a strong nickname. And the same with Museum Sumaya, and the same with the airport. So I have been in at least at least three times in projects. They have huge nicknames, or they have been used heavily by cartoons, as being buildings that for the eyes of the people have maybe form. Like even
Right.
the airport, there has been a lot of different cartoons and creative people, journalists
Right.
that see a specific form in the building. Like some people thought it has, resembles an insect, other people thought that resembles a chicken, other people thought that resembles a human being. So I think that's. That's not negative for me. It's basically meaning that you're working in projects that are meaningful, and that are projects that people are discussing because they are important projects for the community, right?
Right. Right. So I have another question from one of our followers. I'll just pop it up here. Okay. So the Horobi asks, what are the problems will we, as architects, would face once we are out of this pandemic?
Well, I was reading just to an interview, and I think based on the experts, the pandemic can be something that will. There are two visions. No, one vision is that the vaccine is going to come over next year, and that next year we are going to come back to our normal lives. But the other vision is that that will be the case in rich countries, but in poor countries, the virus will keep existing and can mutate to a stronger virus, and that will be still if that's the case, then the virus can come back to our countries and can have
How will
still a
this
huge
affect
impact.
architecture?
So I think like there's two dimensions. No, one dimension is we're still human beings at the deep of our souls. We still are going to be searching to be together, to share spaces together. So I think there are some moments of our business development or the agenda on architecture that will definitely change. I think office buildings typologies will change for sure. I think shopping malls and the traditional experience of going to a shopping mall will completely be transformed and substituted by online shopping, in my opinion. But other moments of the city that are the most basic needs of humans to get together and have the enjoyment of being in a park, walking, or sharing a space with more people, enjoying a wine, enjoying a coffee, have a nice terrace with the sun. The public space is going to remain as one thing that probably before we take it for granted, but now it will be like a very precious moment for us. So I think more than ever will be a conscience of taking care of the public space, and more than ever will be a conscience of also in terms of we have been also now exposed to see the big difference that we have in our cities with less traffic and with less pollution. And I think that will also give us an impact that the city of Mexico doesn't need to be one of the most polluted cities in the planet, and we don't need to
Right.
breathe that quality of air every day, and we can still. I think it will be like many things involved on how we try to address this to the future. I don't have like the crystal ball, but I think our awareness of the impact of pollution in our planet has been heavily exposed to all of us now. And also that doesn't need to be the only way in which we develop the civilization with a
Right.
heavy impact on the planet. So I'm very positive that this crisis have a lot of good things to give us to a civilization, right? With all the pain
Right.
that will bring, of course, and with all the dramatic things we are living, unemployment at its limits, tremendous values in terms of the economy lost. So a lot of painful lives lost. So I think it's a very painful process, but I'm very positive that will bring also incredible positive things to this realization.
Right. So, what it is like to design and work in a country like Mexico as an architect, which has very rich culture and diversity and history, and how does Mexican culture and history affected your architecture?
Well, I think that architecture is a very challenging profession. You need to be like really um, put all your passion in what you do, and being also able to be de alguna manera to have a huge capacity of not be dependent on whether projects happen or not, because architecture has a high chances that projects can fail in any second. But particularly in countries like Mexico, you need to be able to be prepared for anything. Like a project of the scale of the airport, of the importance of the airport, fully financed, can certainly be stopped without even being on the law. So by the most arbitrary decision. So I think it's a very challenging profession, but when you practice in a country like Mexico, it's even more challenging because corruption still exists, lack of the most basic principles can be violated any day by anybody. So unfortunately, so I think we have huge challenges in terms of countries like Mexico in terms of solving the main problems: corruption, the security, social inequality. And so we have huge challenges, and I think each of us, from our own little positions, must try to do their best to try to help to solve those problems, right?
Right. So, uh, I have another question for one of our followers. There we go. What are the new projects that Free is working on? Manuel asks.
Thank you, Manuel. So I am working in something that is like a very symbolic project for me because for a long time I have been very interested in doing temple. Since I am a person that loves meditation, and I have been very touched by religious buildings when I was student by the Chapel of Luis Barragan and then the
Right.
Chapel of Ronchamp by Le Corbusier. So I have been always very interested in designing a chapel, and I'm designing a temple in Korea for a monk, and that's one of my favorite projects. It's a very singular site,
Great.
1 hour from from Seoul. It's a beautiful mountain and next to the river. So it's a very, very special project for me because it's like a small village where the monk is living. The masters that will learn by this monk are also living, and also the temple. So it's like a little community of people that are agents of goodwill, and that for them there's not a god, but the god is nature, and the mountain is the god. So for me, that's like a very, very special project, especially in this moment in history. To being able to work at that scale with that symbolism in that context is like a very powerful opportunity.
Right.
So I'm very happy working on that.
In which stage is that project?
We are now in development of the project. We present a couple of stages, and now we are developing the project in terms of materiality, in terms of solving the specific details that they want to have in terms of how the buildings operate, and we are planning the different stages of how the project can get built during different stages.
Right, right. So I see a comment in here. Which project of yours is your favorite?
I think the next project is always your favorite. It's like I think like
Right.
similar to cinema. Like a director is not thinking in the past movies, but in order to
Future
make them
movies.
then make them happen and exist, you need to focus your attention on the future movies that you're working.
Exactly.
So I am working in a house in the Pacific that I am fascinated and obsessed. I am working in how to transform my own house in the best laboratory that enables me to work in the most efficient way. So I just transform my gym, I'm transforming my kitchen, I'm transforming my garage in a place where I can develop other brands. So I am very interested in using this time to rethink how I'm working and how I transform my own space as a laboratory of work.
Right. Right. So, as one of the pioneers in architecture, how do you think AI and robotic construction can evolve when combined with architecture?
When you see the Eiffel Tower was the result of the development of the industry of steel at the time, and it became
Yes.
like it became like a radiography of time, of the civilization development. So I am very interested to see how artificial intelligence, robotic will build the structures that will become also symbols of the future. So I look forward to being able to use those technologies to define buildings. I am an optimistic about the relationship between architecture and intelligence and technology, as much as I know that most of the people are against.
Right. So, as a closer, with all these experiences and the projects that you have done with your visions, what kind of advice would you like to share with young professionals and students?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for young architects is to connect to what they wanted to achieve, and I think it's a very, very challenging profession. But once you are able to connect with your own will, and that if that's what you wanted to do, I think it's an amazing profession because your sketches, your vision will become something that can have a positive impact in the world. Because so I think we have huge responsibility as architects to build project that has a positive impact in the society, right?
Right.
I would say don't try to be worried about money. Try to be worried first about finding what you want to do in life.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you. Would
Thank
you
you.
mind if I ask
Pleasure.
one another question from one of
No,
our
no, it's perfect.
followers?
No, it's perfect,
Okay,
perfect. My
just
pleasure. Yeah.
1 second. Okay, there we go. What do you think of pre-manufactured buildings? Are they any something that you believe will be very common in the future? Fenty
Well,
asks.
I think thank you for the question. I think that modern architecture was able to create repetition. So all the vision of social housing post-war in the 40s, 50s in Europe was the result of that conscience of repetition and modulation on the structures. This brought to 21st century will mean that we need to find more efficient way to do that, right? So with better
Right.
materials that has more or less negative impact in the planet, that doesn't need to be concrete structures that create pollution, but they can be based on recycled materials. And I really think that we need to bring some of the paradigms of our civilization to the architecture and try to have a more positive impact in the world by using the latest technologies, right?
Great. Thank you. Do you have any final
Thank
words
you.
to say to our followers?
No, thank you. I think enjoy this time. Take this time as an opportunity to review your own process in life, your own ambitions in life. Take white paper and sketch in front of you what you want to achieve in life. Because remember, everything before exists was an idea on a paper by somebody. So
That's
thank
great.
you. It was
Thank
great
you.
to be with you. Thank you. All the
Thank you.
best.
Thank you
Thank you.
for
Bye.
being with
Thanks a
us.
lot.
Goodbye. Goodbye,
My pleasure.
Fernando.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye. Guys, thank you so much for watching this live session. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will continue to invite more architects and designers, maybe artists. Next week we have a couple of artists joining to this live session. And stay tuned with us and stay healthy. Thank you. Ciao. Goodbye.